how have you built a successful client base?
Just as you would build a successful relationship with a patient. Number one, it needs to be equal, and it needs to be mutually beneficial and congruent. You need to be on the same page and understand who you are and why you're doing it, and that needs to be congruent.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Raving Patients Podcast. As you know, I'm your host, Dr. Len Tao, and as always, I'd like to thank my sponsors, both Dental Intelligence and CallRail, for their continued support, allowing me to come to your inbox every single Friday morning at 5 a.m. I also want to remind everybody about my event, Supercharge Your Dental Practice. It's in Fort Lauderdale this year at the Pier 66 Resort and Spa. It's September 26th and 27th. We've got some amazing speakers. You don't want to miss this event. You can go to superchargeyourdentalpractice.com and you can register and save $100 on registration by using the code RAVING, R-A-V-I-N-G. Again, superchargeyourdentalpractice.com. Today's episode is called Clinical Records Prevent Criminal Records. And I'm speaking with Roy Shelburne, someone who's already been on my podcast once before, many, many years ago. He was such a great guest. I wanted to invite him back. So I'm going to read Roy's bio, and then we'll jump into the content of the episode. So Roy went to prison on August 20th, 2008, and was released on May 14th, 2010, and learned a series of lessons the hard way. There are ways to protect and defend a dental practice and to prevent what happened to him from happening to you. Know that if it's not in your clinical record, you didn't see it. You didn't say it, you didn't do it. It didn't need to be done, and it doesn't exist. From the legal perspective, to be prepared for any challenge, the whole dental team must be careful, concise, complete, and diligent, not just a doctor, because the whole team is potentially a risk. Learning and implementing this no-nonsense team approach to record keeping could mean the difference between success and failure in the event of an action or challenge to your practice, and you will result in maximum legitimate reimbursements. So, Roy, thank you for joining me today. I look forward to spending the 30-plus minutes with you discussing a little bit of your background, which I think many people know, but I want you to real briefly describe that in a couple of minutes here. But welcome to the Raving Patients Podcast.
Dr. Lynn, thanks. Always a great pleasure to be with you. Thanks.
I'm excited to have you.
Thank
you. Can you do me a favor?
Sure.
Can you kind of just give a background as to kind of your situation? I know it's you can do a podcast just on that. But, very briefly, what happened,
Sure.
Why were you sent to prison, and
Right.
kind of where you find your place in the industry now?
Thanks. Yeah, I graduated from dental school in 1981, set up my dental practice in my grandfather's hardware store building, had flown to the American Dental Association in California in 2003, had a phone call while I was there from my wife that described the fact that the FBI had come to my office, they'd battered down my back door and were taking all my records. Was investigated for the next 3 years, was indicted, went to trial a year and a half after that. It was a Medicaid issue. They did an evaluation over 6.5 years, and during that 6.5 years I was paid $3.5 million. The jury determines guilt or innocence, and then the prosecution determines the amount that you got that weren't entitled to. And did I make mistakes? I did. Of the $3.5 million that I got, the government proved that I received $17,899.57 more than I was entitled to during that period, and was sentenced to 24 months in federal prison. And even though we were able to go through our records during that 6.5 year period and determine there was work that I did that I could have been paid for and should have been paid for, but just didn't bill for it properly. And that amount was about $30,000, but it made no difference whatsoever. So one of the things I didn't understand is the definition of intent to defraud. I knew if you billed for a service you never provided on a patient you never saw, that would be fraud, but I didn't know the broader definition of intent to defraud, which includes what they call blind disregard, which means if you do the same thing the same way without having systems to identify and correct those errors, that can be considered intent to defraud. So there were a lot of things that I learned during the process that I wished I'd known. So At this point in my life, I share what I have learned in an attempt to prevent anybody else from going through the same thing I did. So that's the reason why I'm here today. That's the reason why I'm sharing the story, not because I'm proud of it, but I want to be the last dental professional who goes to prison for things they didn't know or understand.
And so you came back into the dental industry, and your, I don't want to say your why, but you kind of do what you want to do is really to help people learn from the mistakes that you made, and help people kind of ensure that they don't follow the same path you did. Is it a fair assessment? That's
an exact assessment. It's a wise man who learns from his mistakes, a wiser man still that learns from somebody else's. So I was a crash dummy, sharing what I learned so that I wished I had the opportunity to understand the risks and be able to make that educated decision. Do I want to protect and defend myself, or do I just want to ignore it rather than being oblivious? Ignorance is no excuse. Just like the HIPAA and OSHA regulations, you can't say I just didn't know. As far as the submissions to the insurance and mistakes, can you say I just didn't know? We tried to do the best we could and prevent any action against you. You can't do that. You're ultimately responsible for all of that. And Lynn, you may have had a different experience, but in dental school, did they teach us anything about billing and coding and submission to the insurance? No. And we're responsible for that, absolutely. And the best way to prevent those actions is to provide systems in your practice to identify and correct those errors and document appropriately, which will help to protect and defend you. It'll get you paid. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it will improve patient care, especially if there are multiple doctors in the practice. To be able to get a complete background on a patient that somebody else saw, and to be able to move forward with having all that information, does that streamline the process? It absolutely does. And your patients understand that you know about them, rather than having to backtrack and ask some questions and the patient's going, I told the other doctor that. Why do you not know that? So your clinical records will help to give that foundation and the patient's understanding that you do know about them. Even though it's another doctor, you have all the information you need. So ultimately, will documentation help and all that? Absolutely.
Do you feel, or do you know, I don't know if you know this answer, but if this happened to you now, so it happened in 2008, 2010, times were very different back then.
Sure.
If the same thing happened now, would the result have been different, the same? I mean, there are plenty of people who let's call it what it is, have legal issues, and they don't spend any time in jail. So did you ever investigate or think about what would happen now if it was, 20 years later almost, or 18 years later?
My crystal ball doesn't look very well. It doesn't look very well to the future. In terms of, does the action continue to happen in today's world? It absolutely does. Depending on the situation, the prosecutors, what they feel like they want to do, if there's an action they want to take, or if they want to run for some kind of office, and they need to have a background of stipulating they've been very tough on fraud and abuse. Do they need a poster child? Would they do it again? Yes, they could. Or if they're not wanting to do that, if they don't have that agenda, it varies. And the cases I see all over the country, it still varies. Sometimes they will take action. Sometimes they will only fine. But it's all over the board. It depends on the state and what they want to do. It varies.
So you feel that the reason that there was such a harsh sentence is because they wanted to make an example of you, to teach your colleagues, basically, that if you do this, this is what happens to you?
I do believe that, yes.
Interesting. So as I told you before we got on the line here, there was a dentist in Pennsylvania, and it's a public record. You do a search for it. She was sued for lack of a referral, let's say what it was. And she lost an $11 million lawsuit earlier in 2024. And, if you read the news, the information that's in the news, the dentist had no record. The record went missing, okay? She originally accused the office manager of stealing it, and all this other cockamamie stuff, but the chart is missing and then there's no record, and she lost the lawsuit. The jury did not believe her. And as you said, I think when I read your introduction here, I think you said that if you don't have a record, you didn't say it, you didn't do it, nothing ever occurred. So can you talk about the importance of record keeping? Because I think that it's such a very small detail that I know a lot of practitioners don't pay much attention to. They have their team member do it, which is great, but they don't even look at it. And so I think that in particular, the record keeping part of our jobs is something that's, I wouldn't say overlooked every so often, and how important it is, because that is really truly what happened in the practice.
Yeah. Ultimately, the clinical record, Board of Dentistries in all the states require that it be complete, and it should reflect exactly what happened with that patient. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, our medical cohorts, do they do a good job of documentation? Comparatively speaking, absolutely yes. And sometimes we're looked at as not the real doctors in the medical world, and I think to a great extent that comes from the fact that if the doctor gets a copy of the clinical record of a dentist, it's horrible. It unfortunately, in several cases, when you look at the clinical record of the patient, it is only a list of the services provided so that those services can be billed out. I almost never see a diagnosis. I can see where they have subjectively gone through and identified issues, but in terms of having a diagnosis prior to treatment, I almost never see that. And honestly, would it be appropriate to treat anything in a patient without having a diagnosis prior to? And there again, I'm going to chase a rabbit here a little bit. Lynn, I have to disclose I have ADHD. That's the only test I've ever taken in my life and scored 100% on. I aced that test. But I feel if my crystal ball works appropriately, we in dentistry are going to go from using dental billing, the CDT, to ICD-10 within the next 7 to 10 years. The reason being, insurance companies, they are all about what? The money. So at this point, you have a different division for dental and a division for medical, twice as expensive. So if you blend those together in a medical ICD environment, it reduces the amount of cost for them, and it actually streamlines the process. And if you've been in dentistry, you've seen the shift. Many of the insurance companies, when you send a dental claim to the insurance company, they go, before we're going to consider this, we need to see a medical claim first. So basically, they're trying to push us in that direction. And the ICD coding has been expanded so that it can be described using the ICD codes that exist now. And in that environment, reimbursement with ICD is all based on diagnosis. So having a diagnosis in your clinical record will help to drive the treatment plan, number one. And number two, it will help to get you reimbursed. So why don't you become familiar with the ICD-10 moving forward and bill to medical as much as possible, because the reimbursement is easier. And I see that environment changing moving forward and into that environment. So why not go ahead and do that? But back to the basic, before you treat anything in that patient's mouth, you should have a diagnosis. For example, complete diagnosis for a periodontal issue. It's either mild, moderate, severe, generalized, localized, chronic, or acute periodontal disease, or inflammation. And I see the clinical record and periodontal charting, which would suggest the patient needs scaling root planing. However, there's no diagnosis in the clinical record. So how do you move from this point where there's information but no diagnosis to a treatment that is not driven by the diagnosis? So the clinical record should contain a diagnosis prior to treatment, and that's just one aspect of the clinical record that will help form the foundation for the treatment that's provided, so that when it's reviewed, you can see all the stages, the subjective and then the objective definition and the diagnosis moving forward. And if the clinical record does not contain that, then you're going to have to substantiate the treatment And if you try to do it after the fact, after the treatment's already provided, that's you trying to cover your assets.
Really interesting there. That's a fascinating look at what things. And what's interesting, I can't, you talked about we may be, looking at more standardized stuff. It's crazy. If they go to the ICD, that's going to, you'll take years of CE to figure that stuff out. That, obviously not medical bill. I didn't do any medical billing. Mm-hmm. But I can just imagine the effect that would have on the industry if that ever was something we did. Yeah. So that's nuts. But yes, it's funny. As we've spoken about, I do some work with the State Board of Dentistry, and it's amazing how many times I read the charts, and I'm like, well, I can't even understand what occurred at the visits. So record keeping is super important. Is super important for obviously a variety of reasons, and documenting appropriately. So I want to switch gears here just a little bit, and I want to talk about why documentation is the key to increasing reimbursement, making reimbursement faster, efficient, more effective. So can we switch from the negative part of it now to talking about some of the positive aspects of why you need to keep records in an easy to read format?
Sure, happy to. Len, I lecture a lot, and generally in those lectures, I'll ask those individuals who were responsible for submitting insurance claims to raise their hands. And I said, okay, hold those hands up if you, from your doctor's clinical records, you're always given all the information you need to be able to submit a clean claim to the insurance. And all the hands come down. So what ends up happening is that person at the front desk gets this clinical record. Doctor, you've diagnosed the need for a crown, and there's no substantial information in the clinical record as to the need for that crown. So that person at the front desk has a couple of things they can do. They can talk to the hygienist, or they can talk to the doctor and get the information and be able to submit that to the insurance carrier and get that claim or pre-D approved. The problem where this comes into play is if that person at the front desk is not trained to be able to add that information into the clinical record. So in my practice, Mrs. Smith came in, needed a crown on tooth number 14. I obviously did not document appropriately. My business person would come back to me and say, Dr. Shelburne, Mrs. Smith was here. Why does she need the crown on tooth number 14? And I would roll it off. Mrs. Smith had a large existing alloy restoration. There were marginal decay. 3/4 of the tooth were made up of that crown or of the filling and needed to be removed, and in order to restore contour and function of that tooth we need to place a crown. And she was writing furiously to be able to get all that down. We'd go to the front desk and add all that information, and I'm gonna chase a rabbit here again, Lynn. If you're submitting electronic claims and that person is typing in all that information into the remarks section of the claim, did you know if you're sending that electronically that there are a limited number of characters that will be conveyed from that remarks section? So if it's, say, 30 characters, depending on the company, if you're typing in the Great American Novel and the real support for that crown happens after the 30th character, the insurance company never gets it, because they only get the first 30 characters. So make sure that if it's a long narrative, that it goes on an attachment so that is opened and they can read the entire portion. But if you only put it in the remarks section, that's not going to move forward. So back to the example. So my business person's typing all that in and it doesn't get in the clinical record. That doctor is audited, and this patient was one of the patients that were part of the audit. So the insurance company has a copy of the claim with all the information that supports the need for the crown perfectly, but when they do the review, the clinical record has none of that information. What is the legal support for that crown?
Nothing.
It's the clinical record.
Okay.
So the insurance company looks at that clinical record and said, this is not supported clinically, so we should not have paid this. And the insurance company used what's called an extrapolation formula. So if they've done 20 charts and they find that 15% of the crowns that were provided were not substantiated in the clinical record, they use the 15%, they multiply 15% for the past 7 years because the statute of limitations on fraud is 7 years, and they ask 15% back for all the crowns that they paid during that period. And I've seen doctors have requests for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 because of lack of documentation. So that will help you substantiate the need for that in a way that it is appropriate from that standpoint. It will also help to protect and defend you. So if a patient has a complaint to the board, for example, you provided a crown or a bridge that they didn't think met standard of care, and they make a complaint to the board primarily will ask for a copy of the clinical record for the doctor who provided the service. So if that is complete, soup to nuts, T's crossed, I's dotted, more than likely that's not going to be an issue as far as the documentation piece. But more importantly, from a malpractice standpoint, our attorney friends are like everybody else. They don't like to work very hard. They want low-hanging fruit. So if that patient goes to attorney thinking they're going to initiate a malpractice claim against this doctor, the primary thing that attorney is going to do is ask for a copy of that patient's clinical record. And if they get a clinical record from the dentist that is complete, substantiates very, very strongly what was done, why it was done, supportively, will that attorney take that case and move forward? It's unlikely, because it's a hard case to make, because it's so well supported from the doctor's point of view. However, if they get a clinical record and there's a lot of leeway, it's not complete, there's a lot of things though, this doesn't make sense, there's a lot of wiggle room there. And unfortunately in today's legal system, if you are in a trial and you testify and a patient testifies, who is the jury going to believe? The rich dentist or the poor patient who is abused? It's the patient.
Poor patient who's going to, yes, 100%.
Yeah, so it's a uphill climb. So your clinical records will help defend you. Not only, it'll get you paid, it'll defend you from the board of dentistry, any actions. And I was involved in a couple of cases where there was a complaint to the board about the dentist's standard of care. The dentist was a great dentist, provided great standard of care. There was no issue with that, but their clinical records were horrible. So there was an actual action against the dentist because the clinical records did not meet standard of care, and that went in their data bank that they had been cited by the board, even though this was a great clinical dentist. Something as technical as the clinical records can also add to that risk that you have in your practice, and it will also reduce the chances of a malpractice action if you cover all your bases that way. So trifecta.
Yeah, and so the moral of the story is if it's not in your chart, it never happened. And
it did not happen.
Including the diagnosis and the reason that the person needs the procedure. And I'll just use another example that seems to be a common one that I hear about, cracked tooth syndrome, where patient presents with biting pain, reproducible, using a tooth sluice, requires a full coverage crown. That has to be in there. You can't just put it on the note to the insurance company, because if it's not in there and they do audit you, there's no proof that there was even a crack in the tooth.
Yeah,
So,
and there again, insurance company. I'm going to segue off that if you don't mind, Lynn. There's insurance companies. As far as a cracked tooth, you can take pictures. And there's an obvious crack there, and you send it to the insurance carrier and they deny it. There are magic words that are associated with some reimbursements, and one of the magic words with a cracked tooth is some kind of discomfort. So make sure that if a patient is experiencing pain on biting or releasing, that is in the clinical record and it goes on the claim form. If it's only cracked, many times the insurance companies go, almost all teeth are cracked to some extent. If they're asymptomatic, that does not make it medically necessary. So there again, be aware of the magic words that are associated with those claims that you send to increase the likelihood of it getting reimbursed.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part of the whole process is that this is 100% avoidable. Okay,
yes.
and we always say less is more, but in this case, more is more. You can never have too much information
Right.
an overabundance of information in the chart, but you can have a lack of information. And a lot of
Correct.
the charts that I read, it says, 1 PA taken, MILF filling, and that's, in the shade. That doesn't do anything. I mean, I laugh when I see that. So,
Yeah.
when I look at records, I want to see that I want to be able to read it and know exactly what took place when the patient was in the chair, and that's
Yeah,
really
well
how you
said.
have to look at it. So,
Well said. Yeah.
so let's talk about ways to protect yourself, and things you recommend doing in order to, again, do it the proper way, protect yourself, defend yourself, and make sure that if something does happen to you, you're fully covered from any type of action against the board, or from the board, action from the insurance company, action
Sure.
from a patient.
So if you accept reimbursement from any type of government entity, and a lot of people think that's only Medicare or Medicaid, and of course those are reimbursed from the government standpoint, but it also includes federal employees, dependent of active duty military, anybody who is insured under the Affordable Health Care Act. All those to some degree are reimbursed by federal or government funding. That being the case, there is a 7-step compliance program that is mandated. And there again, when I'm speaking, I'll ask people to raise their hand if they accept any of those type of plans, and almost everybody does, one or all of those. And I said, how many of you have the mandated 7-step governmental compliance program in your practice? And I've had, over the years, 3 people continue to raise their hands. And in all of those 3 instances, they had an action that made them aware of the fact that they needed to have those in your practice. And even if you're not involved in any of those plans, I was talking earlier about what's considered blind disregard, which means you continue to do the same thing the same way without having something in your practice to identify and correct those errors. Having this compliance program in your practice will take the blind disregard off the table, because you're doing what's considered reasonable to identify and correct those errors as you move forward. Will you be perfect? Never. Can you strive to identify and continue to improve? Absolutely. And that makes it clear that you're trying to meet the standard and improve as you go forward. So 7-step compliance program. Step number 1, you need to determine that you're going to initiate the program. Number 2, you need to identify a compliance program director, and that does not the person who does it all themselves. It'll be somebody on your team who actually may identify the date that you're going to do the evaluation. They mark off the calendar. They identify the random charts that you're going to review. You need to establish, third, you need to establish your expectations. So your documentation, you need to get together with your clinical team, your hygienist, and say, we're going to work through this and put together. It can be a template or whatever the expectations are. This is what our expectations are. Then there needs to be training so that everybody on the team understands their responsibility of that program, what they need to do to be able to add to that clinical record to make sure everything's covered. There needs to be an ability for that individual to give feedback back and forth. So doctors, you need to have a conversation with your team about what's the expectation. The team needs to be able to communicate with the doctors and say, I know we're initiating this new program. We're going to improve our documentation during this period. We're going to need a little bit extra time to be able to implement that. Can you give us 5 minutes more? And they need to be able to give back and forth. If they don't understand, they need to be able to talk to your doctor to be able to do that. Then you need to have a system when you identify there are things that are happening or not happening in the clinical record that need to be improved. For example, health histories are not being updated appropriately, and maybe there's not in the template a line that says health history review and what was done during that period. You might add that to be able to make that improvement moving forward. So whatever you identify, you need to implement something to be able to make sure that it doesn't continue to happen, that it does improve. And finally, if there is an individual on the team who they understand the expectations, they've been trained appropriately, they're able to give feedback. When issues are identified, they are addressed and they understand they need to improve. If they're unable to do that, that individual needs to be terminated because they are jeopardizing the patient care and the practice and the team. So that's in a nutshell, that 7-step compliance program. And the way you document that, it's just like a meeting minutes. On February the 15th, we met with Dr. and whoever else was doing the review. We identified 20 random charts to be able to review, and this and such is what we did, and just keep a running history of what you did and then what you implemented and how you directed that moving forward. And if you have that in your practice, that will help to improve your documentation. It will also help to reduce the risk. It'll get you paid more effectively, and you will continue to improve moving forward.
Got it. So is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we have not covered at this point?
Good question. Just the fact that every team member needs to understand that they're responsible for making those entries in that clinical record. For example, if a patient cancels or changes appointment, you can actually codify that. There are codes that you can actually add to the patient record. But if a patient's non-compliant, does that have an overall effect on the success or failure of the service that you provide? The answer is absolutely yes. So that needs to be captured in an area of the clinical record that cannot be modified. A lot of softwares will track missed and canceled appointments, but if that's in an area where you can change it, highlight it and change the 4 to 5, that is a clinical record written in pencil. So I recommend that even something as, non-critical, well, it is critical. Something as small as that needs to go in the clinical record. Patient canceled, patient no-showed, patient changed appointment, because that's a clinical issue if they're not coming to the appointment. So that person at the front desk, should they be trained to be able to add that information? Yes. Same thing with chief complaints. You think only the doctor or the hygienist can do that. The patient, if they make a chief complaint to anybody in that practice, there's a reasonable expectation that the doctor is going to be made aware of that. So that needs to be part of the clinical record as well. So there are a lot of things that we don't think about that should be captured in that clinical record that aren't, and it's just a way to protect and defend moving forward and actually increase and improve patient care.
I have one last question for you myself, though. The last question I had for you is, what do you say to somebody who is still doing written notes versus computer notes?
Oh my gosh, I am so sorry for you. I won't say it's impossible. It's nearly impossible to put together a complete clinical record using written notes, and it is probably the worst use of the doctor's time, energy, and effort. And I understand, you don't want to give that up because you feel it's important, and it is important, but your team and your software will help to streamline the process in a way that will give you so much time back that you can spend, more importantly, providing patient care and developing that relationship with the patient, and use your time wisely. Don't use it doing something as mundane as that, because you don't need to. Offload anything, doctors, that you can appropriately to that team member, and the board, they don't care who does it. Doctors, you need to review it and make sure that it's correct and then sign it. But do you have to do that? Absolutely you don't. Use your time, and your time best doing what you are trained and most effective doing. Got it.
All right, let's segue into my lightning round Q&A. We're running a few minutes late, but I thought the content was too important, so I figured we would just let it go. So, real quick here, Roy, just to reiterate, I'm going to ask you 8 to 10 questions. Answer these literally lightning round. You don't need to go into long, drawn-out answers, okay?
Cool.
So, what habits have helped make you successful?
Oh, never giving up.
What has been your most satisfying moment in business?
Having someone after a lecture walk up to me and said, "Thank you, you have literally changed my life."
That's great. Do you have a system in place to keep yourself organized?
Yes, it's my wife.
That's good. What business-related book has inspired you the most, or what is your favorite book?
The 7 Habits of the Highly Successful Individual. Covey.
Yep. I hear that a lot. Who is someone that you would love to collaborate with, and what would you love to collaborate on?
Oh, gee. Simon Sinek on identifying clearly your why.
That's a great one too. How have you built a successful client base?
Just as you would build a successful relationship with a patient. Number one, it needs to be equal, and it needs to be mutually beneficial and congruent. You need to be on the same page and understand who you are and why you're doing it, and that needs to be congruent.
Has anyone in your network been important to your journey?
Oh my gosh, so many people. Beth Johnson and Samir Basine, Linda Miles, Lois Banta, Ross Nash, Deborah Nash. There have been so many mentors in my life that have been so pivotal in my moving forward.
Yeah, that wasn't, I think you told the story, that wasn't Linda the one who invited you to SCN, or invited you to get, once you had gotten out of prison and stuff, to kind of get things moving back on track? Isn't that correct?
Actually, the day after I was released from prison, I was at the SCN meeting because Linda made that happen. Yeah,
I remember that story. So that's a great story. So,
Yeah.
this is a tough question. So we'll see what you come up with here. If you had to open up a lemonade stand tomorrow, what would you call your stand?
Lemons to lemonade. Make it count.
That's good. Do you keep a journal, and does it help you?
I do. It's a photograph journal. I'm a visual guy as far as a written guy knows, so I try to. I do photo books, and if it's a meeting I'm going to, I try to put all those together in a folder. If it's a vacation I go to, I try to put all those in a folder. So it's kind of a visual journal.
That's great. 2 last questions. What have you learned from the most successful person you know?
Don't take yourself too seriously.
I like that. Last question, I ask everyone this. If there was one subscription, either business or personal, one subscription that you cannot live without, which one would it be? So something you pay for on a monthly basis or an annual basis.
Right. That's probably Rich Man, Poor Man, the newsletter.
Okay.
Yeah.
That works. That's a new one. Roy, that was great. Thank you for answering those questions. If somebody wants to talk to you about a situation they're in, they want to obviously get help from you, what's the best way for them to contact you? And I think you had a complimentary assessment for anybody as well.
Email's probably best, or text. Email is ROY_Shelburne, SHELBURNE @hotmail.com. Text 423-552-6111. And yeah, if somebody wants to reach out and 15-minute consult, and if they want to just talk about their current documentation and request some information or some support or suggestions, happy to do that.
Well, as always, this was awesome. Second time's a charm. They like to say. No, third time's a charm, but this time was the second time. So this was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your story with the viewing and listening audience. Guys, if you want to reach out to Roy, he gave you his contact information, and he's willing to do an assessment for you. So please reach out to him. If you listen to this episode and think that the information would help one of your colleagues, please share it with them. Please let them know that Roy's there to help them as well. Remember about my event, Supercharge Your Dental Practice, in South Florida, Fort Lauderdale to be exact, September 26th and 27th of 2025. I want to thank the sponsors again, both Dental Intelligence and CallRail, for their support. And as I end every single episode, remember, your reputation matters. Until the next episode, Roy, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you.